Rico Vandross rubbed his temples and wondered why the universe insisted on giving him headaches instead of a quiet, uneventful Tuesday. The buzzing from the console in front of him was the electronic equivalent of a toddler pulling his hair. Another spike in cloning activity, he muttered to himself, eyes scanning the screen like it just confessed to a murder. As if we needed more idiots in this place. He flicked a switch, trying to coax some cooperation out of the stubborn machine. It blinked back at him, flashing numbers and graphs that all screamed the same thing. Something was rotten in the state of Ganymede-8. Hey Rico, you still alive, or did the console finally win? A voice called from behind him. It was Lyra Chen, his second-in-command and the only person in this floating circus of a mining platform who made his life marginally less miserable. Barely, Rico grunted. We've got a problem. Lyra sidled up next to him, peering at the screen. Looks like a glitch. Maybe the system's just high on its own exhaust again. Or someone's been busy in the cloning bay, Rico replied, scratching his stubbly chin. And I'm betting it's not because they wanted to make more friends. Meanwhile, across the platform in the gaudily decorated Ambassador's Lounge, Vesper Quill was busy not giving a damn about cloning issues. He was too busy basking in the glow of what he called a historic peace treaty with the Zarkonian collective. To peace, prosperity, and the Zarkonians finally getting over that whole humans ate our sacred crab debacle, Vesper declared, raising his glass of synth whiskey. To less paperwork, chimed in his personal assistant, Eric, who had the unenviable job of keeping Vesper's grandiose speeches somewhat tethered to reality. You know, Eric, there's a reason you're my favorite, Vesper grinned, clinking glasses with him. Mostly because you fetch the best whiskey, and because I keep you from signing treaties with terms like eternal servitude, Eric said dryly. Vesper laughed, a carefree sound that echoed in the high ceilings of the lounge. Details. Back in engineering, Rico was less amused. There are only two reasons someone would clone on a gas mining platform: desperation or stupidity. Maybe both, Lyra offered. The crew's been restless since the treaty. They don't trust the Zarkonians. Why would they? Rico snorted. The last time we trusted them, they tried to kidnap half the station. But hey, Rico added with a cynical edge, who doesn't love a good kidnapping attempt to spice up their Thursday? I'll take the kidnapping over the current peace treaty celebration, though, Lyra said. Have you seen the mess hall? It's like a frat party for diplomats. I'd rather deal with whatever fresh hell is brewing in these logs, Rico said, gesturing to the console. At least computers don't get drunk and sing off-key karaoke. They were interrupted by a loud crash from outside the engineering bay. What now? Did someone discover gravity again? I'll check it out, Lyra said, rolling her eyes as she headed for the door. Keep an eye on that screen, would you? Rico nodded and turned back to the console, but his mind was already racing through the possibilities. Someone was cloning, and on Ganymede-8, that meant someone was up to no good. In the heart of the platform's bustling corridors, Lyra found the source of the commotion. A couple of techs wrestling with a stubborn hover cart that had decided to make a break for freedom. Need a hand? She asked, though the sarcasm was thicker than Ganymede's noxious atmosphere. Nah, one of the techs panted. We've almost got it. Sure, Lyra said, watching as the cart bucked again, nearly toppling its contents of spare parts. Because clearly, it's the cart that's out of control, not you. Back in the Ambassador's Lounge, Vesper was launching into another speech. This platform symbolizes unity, progress, and the enduring spirit of humanity, he said, gesturing grandly as he practically tripped over his own words. It also symbolizes how much you like to hear yourself talk, Eric whispered, just loud enough for Vesper to hear. Vesper winked, and don't you forget it. As the crowd began to mingle, Eric spotted Lyra making her way over, looking like she just crawled through a war zone. Lyra, care to join us in celebrating the miracle of diplomacy? I'll pass, she said, glancing at Vesper. You know Rico found something, right? Vesper shrugged. If it's important, I'm sure he'll tell me. I'm ambassadoring right now. Eric chuckled. I'd say you're bastarding. A title I wear with pride, Vesper grinned. Back in engineering, Rico's patience was wearing thin. The logs were adamant about the cloning spike, and no amount of button mashing was changing that. Hey, bucket of bolts, he muttered to the console, give me something useful or I'll melt you down into coffee mugs. As if in response, the screen flickered, then stabilized, displaying a list of recent cloning activities. Rico's eyes widened. This can't be right, he whispered. This many clones. Someone's gearing up for something big. He hit the comm. Lyra, we need to talk. Now. A minute later, Lyra was back, leaning against the doorway with her usual air of nonchalance. What's the panic, Chief? Take a look, Rico said, gesturing at the console. Tell me I'm not losing my mind. Lyra squinted at the screen, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. That's a lot of clones. Way too many for comfort. And no one authorized it. Not a soul, Rico said, scrubbing a hand over his face. Which means we've got a rogue actor on this tin can. Or an army, Lyra suggested. Great, Rico said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Just what we needed, a clone army. It's like a bad vid from the 22nd century. Lyra crossed her arms, a frown etching lines into her forehead. We should tell Vesper. Might as well, Rico said. He'll need to know before he gets too tipsy to care. Good luck with that, Lyra said, already turning on her heel to head back to the ambassador's lounge. Vesper was mid-toast when they found him, raising his glass to something vague and diplomatic. To the bright future of human-Zarkonian relations. And to short speeches, Eric added under his breath, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. Vesper, Lyra interrupted, cutting through the celebratory noise. We need a word. Can't it wait until after the toasts? Vesper asked, his smile faltering. I'm in the middle of a masterpiece here. Not unless you want a few dozen extra guests at your next dinner party, Rico said. Vesper's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Someone's been cloning like there's no tomorrow, Rico explained. And unless you invited an army, we've got a problem. Vesper considered this, his expression shifting from bemusement to something approaching seriousness. An army? Here? Yeah, Lyra said. And unless they're here to help you with diplomacy, we might be in trouble. Well, that does put a damper on things, Vesper murmured, glancing around the room where laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Eric leaned in, his voice low. You think it's the Zarkonians? Maybe, Rico said, or maybe someone else entirely. But whoever it is, they're up to something. Vesper sighed, setting his glass down with a bit more force than necessary. All right, he said, time to earn my keep. As the trio headed out of the lounge, the atmosphere in the corridor felt different, as if the walls themselves were aware of the growing tension. First we stop the cloning, Vesper said, his usual jovial tone replaced by a rare note of urgency. Then we figure out who's behind it. And how do we do that? Eric asked. Just knock on the cloning bay door and ask nicely. That's plan B, Rico said. Plan A is we try to be smart about this. You mean we plan for a change? Lyra quipped, earning a smirk from Rico. Exactly, Vesper said. So let's get to it before our uninvited guests start popping out of the walls. As they made their way to the engineering bay, the gravity of the situation began to settle over them like a heavy fog. If someone was preparing for a takeover, they had to act fast. You know, Lyra said as they walked, I was really hoping for a dull week. Welcome to Ganymede-8, Rico replied. Where excitement happens whether you want it or not. Vesper rolled his eyes. And here I thought diplomacy was going to be the highlight of my day. Guess we're all due for a change, Eric said, checking his datapad. Or at least a drink. As they reached the engineering bay, Rico turned to Vesper. You ready for this? Vesper nodded, though his expression was a mix of determination and that ever-present hint of madness. As ready as I'll ever be. Let's find out what the hell's going on and make sure we still have a platform to step on tomorrow. And maybe, Lyra added, we can manage that without getting ourselves cloned in the process. Here's hoping, Rico said, pushing the door open. For once, let's be the ones pulling the strings instead of the puppets. As they entered the engineering bay, the weight of their task hung over them like a looming storm. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. And hopefully, with a little luck and a lot of sarcasm, they'd come out on top. But on Ganymede-8, as they were learning, luck was always in short supply. The console glared at Rico like an irritated bartender dealing with a belligerent drunk. Its bright screen displayed a mess of numbers and codes that might as well have been hieroglyphs. Rico's eyes scanned the logs again, hoping for a different result as if persistence could somehow change the facts. Sabotage, he muttered. It wasn't a word you threw around lightly, like love or free lunch, but here they were. Lyra leaned against the doorway, arms crossed like she was protecting herself from the cold truth. You sure? Maybe it's just an overeager intern who mistook the cloning bay for the break room. Rico shook his head. These discrepancies aren't accidental. Someone went through a lot of trouble to cover their tracks. It's like trying to find a needle in a stack of other needles. And sharp ones, at that. Lyra peered closer at the screen. Any idea who's behind it? He sighed, rubbing his temples. No fingerprints, no calling card. Just a big, fat, screw you. And in case you hadn't noticed, my patience is as thin as this air out here. Well, Lyra said, at least we know we're not paranoid. Just hated. Good to know we've still got friends, Rico grumbled, shutting down the console with a final, aggressive stab at the power button. Let's go ruin Vesper's day. His day or his speech? Lyra asked, already guessing the answer. Both, if we're lucky. Vesper Quill was practicing his next magnificent oration, in front of a mirror of course, Because what better way to admire the grandeur of your own eloquence? To unity, to prosperity, to someone cloning a bloody army under your nose, Rico interrupted, his voice like a cold splash of reality. Vesper paused, his reflection frowning back at him. Rico, must you always bring doom and gloom to my rehearsals? Consider it a public service, Lyra said, leaning casually against the doorframe. You might want to put down the speech and pick up a plan. Vesper turned, reluctantly setting the digital notes aside. All right, fine, what's the situation? Rico tossed a data chip onto the table, the clatter an accusation in itself. Logs show unauthorized cloning activity, more than just a few extra hands for the kitchen. We're talking dozens, maybe hundreds. Someone's building an army. Vesper's voice was barely above a whisper, his usual bravado dimmed by the gravity of the situation. Or hosting a really creepy family reunion, Lyra quipped. Eric, ever the silent observer, finally spoke up. Have we ruled out the Zarkonians? Rico shrugged. Them, or anyone else with half a brain and a full grudge. But the logs were doctored, and not by amateurs. Vesper huffed, the weight of leadership apparently heavier than he liked. This is supposed to be a time of celebration, not conspiracy. Yeah, well, Rico said, someone out there missed the memo. Or read it and laughed, Lyra added. Vesper ran a hand through his hair, his composure slipping like a soap in the shower. All right, we need eyes on the cloning bay. Discreetly. Last thing we need is panic spreading through the station. Discreet, Rico echoed. Sure, just like our last, discreet, operation where we nearly blew out the station's power grid. I remember it fondly, Lyra said with a smirk. Let's just make sure this one doesn't end with us floating in space. Eric, ever the practical one, was already tapping away at his datapad. I'll start scanning crew activities. Maybe we can pinpoint who had access to the bay around the time of the logs. Good, Vesper nodded, the lines on his forehead deepening. Let's keep this under wraps until we know more. If word gets out, the only thing more chaotic than a clone army is a panicked crew, Rico finished for him. Exactly. As they left Vesper to his preparations, Rico couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go very, very wrong. Maybe it was the way the station's lights flickered ominously, or perhaps it was just the universe being its usual charming self. Back in the heart of the station, the crew was buzzing with the kind of energy that typically preceded a disaster. Conversations were hushed but intense, like everyone was in on a secret except for the few who actually knew what was happening. A low hum of anxiety seemed to hang in the air, as tangible as the stale recycled oxygen they all breathed. The station's inhabitants were edgy, their movements jittery. More than a few were glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting the walls themselves to sprout eyes and start taking notes. Rico and Lyra made their way to the cloning bay with all the subtlety of a freight train in a library. If anyone noticed, they pretended not to. Denial was, after all, one of humanity's greatest talents. Let's see if we can find out who our unwanted guests are, Rico said, nodding toward the security panel. I'm guessing they didn't leave a guestbook. Right, Lyra said, pulling out a hacking module and fitting it to the panel. Here's hoping this is as easy as my last relationship breakup. The module whirred to life, its lights blinking in a pattern that looked suspiciously like Morse code for, abandon hope all ye who enter here. The security panel beeped in protest but finally yielded, its display unlocking with a resigned sigh. Rico raised an eyebrow. I'm impressed. Lyra shrugged, a smile tugging at her lips. What can I say? Electronics love me. People, not so much. The panel revealed a list of recent entries and exits, timestamps included. Rico scanned the list, mentally matching names to faces. Most were routine checks, maintenance crew, the usual suspects. But one name stood out like a sore thumb, Kane Morris. Didn't know Kane was on cloning duty, Rico muttered. He wasn't, Lyra replied, peering over his shoulder. Last I heard, he was stuck in med bay with a bad case of, stop eating the station food. Well, he's either had a miraculous recovery, or someone else is using his ID, Rico said, scratching his chin thoughtfully. So, what now? Lyra asked, crossing her arms and leaning back against the wall. Rico considered their options. We need to talk to Kane. See if he's aware he's been pulling double shifts. And if he doesn't know, then we find out who does, Rico said, a grim determination setting his jaw. And quickly, before they decide to clone the entire station. Their next stop was Med Bay, a place that smelled faintly of antiseptic and regret. Kane Morris was exactly where he was supposed to be, flat on his back in a recovery pod, looking like he'd just wrestled a space kraken and lost. Hey, Kane, Rico greeted, pulling up a chair beside the pod. How's the food poisoning treating you? Kane groaned, opening one eye to glare at them. It's not food poisoning. It's a conspiracy, I tell you. The Zarkonians are trying to kill me. Lyra snorted. Must be a slow day for them. Kane shifted, wincing. What do you want, Rico? I'm not exactly up for company. Just a quick question, Rico said, keeping his tone light. You been down to the cloning bay lately? Kane blinked slowly, confusion etched on his face. Cloning bay? I've barely left this damn bed. That's what I thought, Rico said, exchanging a glance with Lyra. Your ID's been used to access the bay. Care to explain? Kane shook his head, wincing again. Must be a mistake, or someone's idea of a joke. Either way, it wasn't me. All right, Kane, Lyra said, standing up. Get some rest, we'll figure this out. As they left the med bay, Rico's mind was racing. Someone was using Kane's ID to cover their tracks, and they were doing a damn good job of it. But who, and why? Think we're dealing with an inside job? Lyra asked, breaking the silence. Looks that way, Rico replied, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Whoever it is, they've got access and they're not afraid to use it. We need to tighten security. Double the watch on the cloning bay. And what about Vesper? Lyra asked. Think he's taking this seriously enough? Rico sighed, glancing back toward the direction of the ambassador's quarters. He'd better be, or this peace treaty of his is going to be the least of our worries. Guess that means it's up to us to keep this station from going to hell, Lyra said, her voice carrying a note of determination. Story of our lives, Rico agreed, his lips curving into a wry smile. As they headed back to the control room, Rico considered their next move. The station was a powder keg, and someone was playing with matches. It was up to them to figure out who, before everything exploded in their faces. Let's just hope we can stop this before it gets any worse, Rico said, echoing the thoughts that had been circling his mind like vultures. Yeah, Lyra nodded, and maybe, just maybe, we'll live to see another crisis. As they entered the control room, the station's lights flickered ominously, casting long shadows across their faces. It was a reminder that time was running out. Let's get to work, Rico said, his voice steady. Because if there was one thing they knew about Ganymede-8, it was that nothing stayed quiet for long. And this time, they were determined to be ready for whatever hell was about to break loose. The Zarkonian delegation arrived with all the pomp and ceremony you'd expect from a species that took the term, overcompensating, to new intergalactic heights. Their ship was a monstrosity of chrome and unnecessary spikes, the kind of design that screamed, look at us, we're important. It touched down on Ganymede-8 like a beached whale, which was ironic considering the Zarkonians' ongoing grudge about a certain crab incident. Rico watched the proceedings from a distance, hands stuffed in his pockets, trying to ignore the dull throb of his latest headache. Well, there goes the neighborhood, he muttered to Lyra, who stood beside him with her arms crossed and an expression of bored disdain that could have melted steel. At least they brought their best fashion accessories, she replied, nodding toward the Zarkonians' ornate robes. Rico snorted. He was no fashionista, but he'd seen less extravagant attire on royalty. Vesper greeted the aliens with a grin so wide it threatened to split his head in half. Part of being an ambassador was pretending to like people you couldn't stand, and judging by Vesper's performance, he was a master thespian. As the Zarkonians disembarked, complete with their entourage of underlings and ceremonial guards, Vesper launched into a speech that could have lulled a caffeinated monkey to sleep. To unity, he declared, arms spread wide as if expecting applause from the cosmos. To prosperity, to peace between our peoples. There was a polite smattering of applause, mostly from the humans too near to escape without being noticed. Rico crossed his arms tighter, his attention already shifting back to the more pressing matter. The unexplained cloning activity. And the clones themselves. More of them were appearing on the platform, each with personalities that ranged from mildly disturbed to downright homicidal. The latest addition was a clone who introduced himself as Daniel, though he had a peculiar habit of referring to himself in the third person. It was charming in a serial killer kind of way. Rico made a mental note to stay at least one bulkhead away from Daniel at all times. Vesper's gonna ignore this, isn't he? Lyra asked, her tone dripping with the kind of skepticism usually reserved for conspiracy theorists and flat earthers. Of course, Rico replied with a weary sigh. Why bother with reality when delusion is so much more comforting? Vesper's speech continued, his voice a steady drone that mingled with the station's ambient noise. Eric stood dutifully beside him, occasionally offering a nod or the supportive smile of someone who wished they were anywhere else. Rico, Lyra said, pulling him aside as Vesper finally wrapped up his monologue. We need to get into the cloning bay. Something's off, and it's not just the clone's fashion sense. Rico nodded, his gaze lingering on the Zarkonians as they mingled with the humans. I don't like it. Something smells wrong, and it's not just the recycled air. Think the Zarkonians are involved? I think the Zarkonians are involved in everything that goes wrong in this sector, Rico said, his voice low. They've got their claws in more pies than a greedy baker. The pair slipped through the throng of delegates and crew, making their way toward the cloning bay with the practiced ease of people who'd spent far too long dodging responsibility. As they approached, Rico felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a sensation that usually meant someone was either about to shoot him or sell him insurance. The bay door slid open with a hiss, revealing the sterile interior that Rico had come to associate with bad news. Lyra went straight to the console, her fingers dancing over the keys with the practiced grace of a pianist at a funeral. "Let's see what our mystery cloner has been up to," she muttered, her eyes darting across the screen. Rico paced like a caged animal, his mind a whirl of possibilities, each more improbable than the last. The clones, the Zarkonians, the mysterious sabotage, it was all connected. He could feel it in his bones, the way a storm feels imminent before the first cloud even appears. "Got something," Lyra said, snapping his attention back to the present. "Someone's definitely been in here, and they've left a hell of a trail." "Any idea who?" "Not yet," she admitted, a frown etching itself across her forehead. "But they were sloppy, left timestamps and access logs all over the place. Whoever it is, they're either an amateur or they want us to know they're here." Rico leaned over her shoulder, scrutinizing the data with a critical eye. "Or they're just that confident. And confidence, as we both know, usually means trouble." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "You think it's a trap?" "I'm starting to think everything's a trap," Rico replied, straightening up. "And I'm usually right." They left the cloning bay, their minds still buzzing with the implications of what they'd found. The Zarkonians, with their pomp and circumstance, were a distraction, a loud, flashy diversion that kept everyone's attention away from the shadows where the real danger lurked. "Rico," Lyra said as they walked, her voice tinged with a seriousness that made him stop. "If this goes south, we're the ones holding the bag." "Wouldn't be the first time," Rico said with a grim smile. "And I doubt it'll be the last." The station's lights flickered again as they made their way back to the main concourse, a reminder of just how precarious their situation was. Rico could feel the tension in the air, the way it clung to his skin like a second layer of clothing. The Zarkonians were mingling with the humans, their voices a low hum that underscored the electronic chatter of the station. Rico watched them with a wary eye, searching for anything out of place. It was like trying to spot a needle in a haystack while blindfolded and spun around for good measure. As they passed through the crowd, Rico caught sight of Daniel, the clone with the unsettling habit of speaking in riddles. He was standing off to one side, staring at the Zarkonians with an intensity that made Rico's skin crawl. "Hey, Daniel," Rico called, approaching the clone with cautious steps. "Enjoying the party?" Daniel turned slowly, his expression inscrutable. Daniel finds the proceedings intriguing. "Intriguing how?" Rico asked, leaning against a nearby bulkhead. "Daniel wonders why the Zarkonians are so interested in humans," the clone replied, his voice a low murmur. "Why they seek peace now, when war has been their companion for so long." Rico exchanged a glance with Lyra. "That's the million-credit question, isn't it?" "Perhaps the answer is simpler than we think," Daniel continued, his gaze shifting to the crowd. "Or perhaps it is hidden in plain sight." "Thanks for the cryptic wisdom," Lyra said, her tone half joking, half serious. "Anything else you want to share?" Daniel shook his head, his attention already drifting back to the Zarkonians. "Daniel speaks only what he sees. The rest is up to you." With that, the clone turned and melted into the crowd, leaving Rico and Lyra to ponder his words. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and Rico's patience was wearing thin. "Vesper's still got his head up in the clouds," Lyra said, guiding Rico's attention back to the ambassador, who was currently engaging a Zarkonian delegate in what appeared to be a conversation about the finer points of Earth cuisine. "Yeah, well," Rico muttered, "let's hope he doesn't choke on it." They spent the next few hours weaving through the crowd, making polite conversation when necessary, but mostly observing. The clones were becoming more prevalent, their slightly off behavior a stark contrast to the polished pretense of the treaty celebration. "Vesper's gonna love this," Lyra said, nodding toward a group of clones who were busy dissecting a Zarkonian banner with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. "At this rate, we'll have clone riots by morning." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Rico said, his voice low. "If the Zarkonians find out, we'll be neck-deep in diplomatic incidents," Lyra finished for him. Just another day at the office. As they circled back to the ambassador's lounge, Rico's mind raced with 100 different possibilities. The clones, the Zarkonians, the sabotage, it was all connected, a web of intrigue that threatened to ensnare them all. "You think Vesper will listen this time?" Lyra asked, her skepticism evident. "Probably not," Rico admitted, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "But we'll make him listen." Or die trying. The station lights flickered once more, casting long shadows across the floor. It was a reminder of the urgency of their mission, the ticking clock that hung over their heads like a guillotine. As they stepped back into the lounge, Rico squared his shoulders, ready to confront Vesper with the latest developments. The ambassador was still engaged in conversation, his charm as relentless as ever. "Vesper," Rico said, cutting through the chatter with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "We need to talk, now." The ambassador turned, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Rico, can't this wait?" "We're on the brink of—" "No," Rico interrupted, his voice firm. "It can't. We have a situation, and if we don't deal with it, there won't be a treaty left to celebrate." Vesper's smile faltered, replaced by a frown that spoke of weary resignation. "Very well," he said with a sigh. "Let's hear it." As Rico laid out the details, the clones, the Zarkonian involvement, the potential for disaster, he watched Vesper's expression shift from disbelief to reluctant understanding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "We have a problem," Vesper finally said, his voice a low growl. "And it's not going away on its own." "Then let's do something about it," Rico replied, his determination unwavering. "Before it's too late." As the station's lights flickered one final time, Rico couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a precipice, the abyss yawning wide beneath them. But for now, he pushed that thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. Because if there was one thing Rico Vandross knew, it was that you didn't back down from a fight, even when the odds were stacked against you. Rico Vandross had felt a headache coming on ever since he'd woken up to the realization that his life had become one long series of diplomatic nightmares. Now, as he stood watching Vesper Quill try to keep a lid on the boiling kettle of human-Zarkonian relations, the headache had blossomed into a full-blown migraine. "Rico," Lyra leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying a weight of urgency. "We've got a problem." Rico's immediate thought was that of course they had a problem. When didn't they have a problem? It was practically their job to have problems. But he gestured for Lyra to continue anyway. "Power outage across the station," she said, nodding toward the flickering lights. "And security picked up some movement in the lower decks." Movement? Rico felt a sinking feeling, akin to the sensation of finding out your spaceship had been parked in a no-hover zone. As in, there shouldn't be any kind of movement? Exactly. "And get this," Lyra added, her lips curving into a wry smile that never promised anything good. "Unauthorized clones." Rico sighed heavily, the kind of sigh reserved for moments when someone hands you a steaming pile of intergalactic dung and expects you to polish it. "Of course there are. We need to check it out, before our esteemed guests grow any more suspicious." And by esteemed guests, she meant the Zarkonians, who hovered around the room like sentient, chrome-plated vultures. Rico shot a glance at Vesper, who was valiantly attempting to hold a conversation with one particularly spiky delegate. The ambassador's smile was starting to resemble a grimace. "Can't wait to see how Vesper spins this one," Rico muttered before nodding to Lyra. "All right, let's go play detective." They made their way through the crowd with the practiced ease of people who'd done this sort of thing too many times for comfort. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows that danced across the bulkheads as if mocking the whole proceedings. In the corridor, they ran into Tinker, the station's maintenance bot. Tinker had been cobbled together from more spare parts than Rico could count, and he had a personality to match. "Hey, Tinker," Rico greeted as the bot trundled up, its mismatched eyes blinking asynchronously. "Heard anything interesting?" Tinker whirred, his voice box buzzing with the static of a machine that had seen better days. "Interesting? Define interesting." "The station's falling apart, the ambassadors are bickering, and someone keeps stealing my damn cleaning supplies." Lyra smirked. "So, business as usual, huh?" "Pretty much," Tinker confirmed, a hydraulic arm gesturing in what Rico assumed was meant to be a shrug. "But if you're asking about the power outage, I might know a thing or two." Rico exchanged a glance with Lyra. "Enlighten us, Tinker. Your unauthorized clones. They've been mucking about with the power grid," Tinker said, his tone as nonchalant as a bot who'd seen it all. "Saw dragging cables and whatnot down to the lower decks." "Perfect," Rico grumbled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "As if things weren't complicated enough. And if they screw up the power grid anymore, this whole station's gonna end up darker than an interstellar black hole," Tinker added helpfully. "Great. Just what we needed," Lyra said, sarcasm dripping from her words like oil from a leaky engine. "Lead the way, Tinker." The maintenance bot led them through the dimly lit corridors, the hum of the station's systems their only accompaniment. As they descended into the bowels of Ganymede-8, Rico felt a growing sense of foreboding. Unauthorized clones, power outages, Zarkonians, this whole situation was shaping up to be one of those stories nobody ever wanted to tell their grandkids. They arrived at the lower decks, the air thick with the smell of ozone and something else Rico couldn't quite place. Tinker pointed a metal appendage toward a flickering console. Here, they've been accessing the system from here. Lyra approached the console, her fingers dancing across the keys. This doesn't make any sense. It's like they're intentionally trying to get caught. Or they're setting a trap, Rico countered, his voice grim. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, Rico was reminded of his childhood fear of the dark, the way the shadows seemed to whisper secrets to one another just beyond his comprehension. Then the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the corridor in a sickly red glow that didn't so much reassure as it did make everything look like a scene from a particularly violent horror vid. Rico's comm crackled to life, Vesper's voice tense on the other end. Rico, we've got a situation up here. Where are you? Lower decks, Rico replied, annoyed at the obvious question. Trying to figure out what the hell's going on with the clones. Well, figure faster, Vesper snapped, his usual calm replaced by a rare edge of panic. The Zarkonians are getting twitchy, and I doubt they're gonna sit around sipping cordial if they think we're hiding something. On it, Rico said, cutting the connection with perhaps more force than necessary. Let's hurry this up. I'd rather not be known as the guy who started an interstellar war because of a lighting malfunction. Tinker led the way deeper into the deck, where the unauthorized clones had apparently set up shop. As they moved forward, Rico couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His instincts screamed danger, a primal fear that whispered of traps and ambushes. Daniel's been acting strange, too, Lyra noted, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. We should keep an eye on him. Great, Rico muttered, more problems. They rounded a corner and stopped short. Before them stood ranks of clones, each one identical to the next, their expressions blank yet somehow menacing. Well, this is cozy, Rico said, his voice filled with forced cheerfulness. Anyone got a deck of cards? The clones ignored him, their attention fixed on a makeshift console at the far end of the room. Rico approached cautiously, every step feeling like it could be his last. Lyra moved to the console, her fingers once again ablur over the keys. They're accessing the station's systems. Looks like they're trying to shut down the power across the whole sector. Why? Rico asked, his frustration mounting. What do they stand to gain from this? Chaos, Lyra replied simply, her eyes never leaving the screen. And in chaos, opportunities arise. Opportunities for who? Tinker chimed in, clearly intrigued despite himself. That's what we need to find out, Rico said, turning his attention to the clones. Anyone here feel like talking? The clones remained silent, their expressions unchanged. Rico sighed, the kind of sigh that could deflate a starship's ego. Looks like they're the strong, silent type, Lyra quipped, her sarcasm a comforting balm in the face of the unknown. Maybe, Rico said, narrowing his eyes as he surveyed the room. But there's always someone pulling the strings, and I intend to find out who. Back at the ambassador's lounge, Vesper was struggling to keep the peace. The Zarkonians were restless, their patience wearing thinner than the plot of a bad holo novel. Ambassador Quill, one of the Zarkonians intoned, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. We grow tired of these distractions. Our agreement is at stake. Vesper forced a smile, the kind that showed too many teeth and held none of the warmth. We appreciate your patience, esteemed delegate. Rest assured, we are addressing the situation as we speak. The Zarkonian's eyes narrowed, their chrome-plated visage reflecting Vesper's strained expression back at him. Do not test our tolerance, human. With a curt nod, the Zarkonian turned away, leaving Vesper to stew in his own frustration. He needed results, and he needed them yesterday. Back in the lower decks, Rico and Lyra were piecing together the final threads of the mystery. The console screen flickered with data, revealing the origins of the unauthorized clones. They're a distraction, Lyra concluded, her expression a mix of annoyance and grudging respect for whoever engineered this chaos. Someone's using them to cover their tracks. And we thought we had trust issues, Rico muttered. Any idea who? Lyra shook her head. Not yet, but there's a message hidden in the code. A location. Then I guess that's our next stop, Rico said, determination in his eyes. Let's wrap this up before Vesper has a full-blown diplomatic incident on his hands. The clones remained eerily still as Rico and Lyra made their exit, a silent army waiting for orders that would never come. As they made their way back to the main levels, Rico's thoughts were already spinning ahead, strategies forming and dissolving in the span of heartbeats. Vesper was waiting for them, his demeanor as welcoming as a bear trap. Well, we know where they're holed up, Rico said without preamble, and we're gonna shut 'em down. About time, Vesper replied, his relief tempered with frustration. The Zarkonians are ready to walk, and I don't have enough charm in the universe to stop them if this keeps up. We're on it, Lyra assured him, casting a glance at Rico. Let's finish this. Together, they prepared to confront the hidden threat, driven by the knowledge that failure wasn't an option. The fate of Ganymede-8, and possibly more, rested on their shoulders, a burden they bore with grim determination. And as they plunged back into the labyrinthine depths of the station, Rico couldn't help but think that this was precisely the kind of mess he'd expected when he'd signed up for this job. The kind that made you question your life choices, even as you charged headlong into the fray. Because if there was one thing Rico Vandross knew, it was that in the vast, uncaring expanse of the cosmos, heroes were just idiots in the right place at the right time. Rico Vandross had a headache that danced on the line between mild nuisance and murderous rage. It was a sensation akin to having a drill boring into his temples while someone played a discordant symphony on his nerves. And the addition of hostile clones in the dim bowels of Ganymede-8 was not improving his mood. Well, this is a real party, Rico grumbled, glancing around at the ranks of identical faces. I always wanted to be surrounded by dangerous idiots. Just not quite this literally. Lyra, ever the sharp-tongued second in command, gave a short laugh. At least you don't have to remember anyone's name. Good point, Rico conceded, rubbing his forehead as if willing the migraine away by sheer irritation. You've always got a silver lining for everything, don't you? You know me, she replied, her smile as sharp as a serrated blade. Optimism is my middle name. Before Rico could retort, the clones stirred. Their synchronized movements reminded him of a well-oiled machine, if that machine was designed solely to beat the living daylights out of him. Tinker, Rico called to the maintenance bot that had become a reluctant partner in their misadventures. Any ideas here? Tinker whirred, his mismatched eyes blinking as if considering their options. Unless you brought a can opener for some impromptu deactivation, I'm out of ideas. Rico sighed. Fantastic. We're cornered by homicidal doppelgangers, and our best plan is, try not to die. Sounds like most of our plans, Lyra quipped, checking the charge on her sidearm. Should we start shooting? Before they could decide, a console at the far end of the room crackled to life. A voice, distorted but unmistakably smug, emanated from the speakers. Ah, Rico Vandross. Always stepping into trouble head first. How predictable. Rico scowled. The voice belonged to someone he loathed more than his current migraine. Nice to know I have admirers, he called out, sarcasm lacing his words. Who the hell are you? A friend, the voice replied, dripping with condescension. Or an enemy. Context matters, doesn't it? Rico didn't have time for games. Not with clones inching closer. Cut the cryptic crap. What do you want? What anyone wants, the voice said. Power, control, and a little chaos for good measure. That's three things, Tinker pointed out helpfully, earning him a glare from Rico. A pause, then the voice continued, unfazed. You and your allies won't stop us. The Zarkonians have already seen to that. Zarkonians, Lyra repeated, eyes narrowing. What's their game? Game? Oh, it's more of a coup, the voice taunted. While you bumble about with these clones, they're securing their control of this station. Enjoy the show. The console cut off with an ominous beep, leaving Rico with more questions and fewer answers. Figures, Rico muttered. Always a twist. Just once. I'd like a straightforward disaster. Where would the fun be in that? Lyra asked, raising her weapon. So, shoot first and ask questions later. Sounds like our best option, Rico agreed, gripping his own sidearm. Let's give hell. They opened fire, the room lighting up with flashes of energy bolts. Clones fell, one after another, their circuits fried or disconnected. Yet for every clone they dropped, two more seemed to take its place. Meanwhile, back in the fluorescently lit pit of diplomacy hell known as the Ambassador's Lounge, Vesper Quill was realizing just how deep in the muck they really were. The Zarkonian delegates, usually as expressive as a slab of steel, were now buzzing with something that might have been excitement, or rage. Hard to tell with Zarkonians. Ambassador, Vesper greeted through clenched teeth, trying to maintain the veneer of civility. Is everything satisfactory? The lead Zarkonian, a chrome-clad nightmare named Zaurax, turned his unnerving gaze on Vesper. Your station is weak, human. Vulnerable. We have no place for weakness in the collective. Noted, Vesper replied, smile sharper than a guillotine. But we still have an agreement. Zaurax's mandibles flexed, emitting a noise that could have been laughter or a death rattle. Agreements can be renegotiated. Vesper's stomach dropped. That sounds an awful lot like a threat. A mere observation, Zaurax corrected, though the glint in his eyes suggested otherwise. We Zarkonians value strength. It might be time to reassess the balance of power. Vesper nodded, internally cursing every cosmic entity he could think of. Keeping these negotiations afloat was like trying to juggle knives in zero gravity, difficult, dangerous, and likely to end badly. Excuse me, he said, stepping back to bark orders into his comm. Eric, I need you to get a message to Rico. We might be running out of time. Already on it, sir, Eric's voice crackled back, annoyingly efficient as always. But you might want to brace for impact. Things are about to go sideways. Wonderful, Vesper muttered, the sarcasm a thin shield against the rising tide of panic. Just the pep talk I needed. Back in the bowels of the station, Rico and Lyra found themselves back to back, blasting away at the seemingly endless wave of clones. Tinker hovered behind them, providing the occasional sarcastic commentary and, when necessary, a makeshift cover. We really need to stop meeting like this, Rico shouted over the din. Next time, let's plan for a beach vacation, Lyra suggested, downing another clone with a well-placed shot. Deal, Rico agreed, mostly to keep his mind off the escalating chaos. Assuming we survive this. Big assumption, Tinker added, his tone managing to be both mechanical and sardonic. But I admire your optimism. Rico was about to retort when his comm buzzed with an incoming message. It was Eric, and his voice was devoid of its usual calm professionalism. Rico, we've got a problem, he said, his voice strained. The Zarkonians are preparing to seize control of the station. We need you topside, now. Perfect, Rico drawled, the words saturated with irony. Just what I needed, a deadline. We'll handle it, Lyra assured him, firing off another volley. Go play hero. Rico hesitated, but only for a moment. He trusted Lyra with his life, and more importantly, with his job. Keep these tin soldiers busy, he instructed, then sprinted down the corridor. The station trembled as he ran, the lights flickering ominously. It felt as if the very bones of Ganymede-8 were groaning under the weight of betrayal and sabotage. Rico pushed on, teeth gritted against the unyielding pulse of his headache. When he finally reached the main level, the scene was one of barely organized chaos. Humans and Zarkonians milled about, their interactions tense and terse, like a bomb waiting for the slightest spark to ignite it. Vesper was waiting for him, looking as if he'd aged a decade in the past hour. Rico, he greeted, relief mingled with desperation. What the hell is going on? Clones are a diversion, Rico summarized, catching his breath. Zarkonians have a coup in mind. And I think we're on the guest list, whether we like it or not. As delightful as that sounds, Vesper said, sarcasm etched deeply into his voice, we need to stop it. Now, got any ideas that don't end in complete annihilation? Rico asked, eyes scanning the crowded room for potential threats, or allies. Not really, Vesper admitted, his smile a grimace. But I hear necessity is the mother of invention. Great, Rico said, rolling his eyes. Now we're relying on clichés to save us. With no time to waste, Rico and Vesper set to work, rallying what crew and resources they could muster. The Zarkonians were careful not to make any overt moves, but the tension in the air was as thick as the fog of war. Amidst the chaos, Eric moved like a shadow, slipping through the crowd with messages and updates. They're positioning themselves, he reported quietly. Looks like they're planning to hit the command deck first. Figures, Rico replied, rubbing at his temples. They're always after the top prize. How's the migraine? Eric asked, his expression one of genuine concern. About as fun as this situation, Rico replied, not bothering to hide his frustration. But I'll live, I think. Glad one of us will, Eric said, patting him on the shoulder. Let's make it count. With plans hastily drawn, they prepared for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. The Zarkonians, ever precise, moved with a confidence that was almost insulting in its arrogance. Rico watched them, the migraine now a dull throb overshadowed by the gravity of the moment. Well, he said, turning to Vesper. Any last words? Just one, Vesper replied, his eyes hardening with resolve. Win. It was as good a mantra as any, Rico decided. And as the first cracks of conflict echoed through the station, he clung to that single word with all the stubborn determination he could muster. Because in the grim dark void of space, where alliances crumbled like old starships and friends could turn on a dime, sometimes winning was the only thing that mattered. Rico Vandross stood there, his mind racing faster than a hyperdrive on a caffeine binge. The clones were a distraction, a minor inconvenience compared to the Zarkonians' real game, station control. But Rico had a plan, a wild, half-baked, probably suicidal plan. Just another Tuesday in the universe's armpit. All right, let's get creative with this, Rico announced, his voice barely above the station's constant hum. It was a hum that usually meant the station was working. Today, it was more like a dirge. This station's a gas mining platform, right? Let's use that. Vesper looked at him, brow furrowed in confusion. Gas mining? You want to throw a pickaxe at them? Not exactly, Vesper. I was thinking more along the lines of a controlled explosion. Vesper blinked. Controlled explosion? How does that even? Tinker, Rico called out, interrupting Vesper's skepticism. You still with me, buddy? Tinker, who had been preoccupied with a loose panel that refused to stay closed, looked up. Barely. What can I do you for? We need to manipulate the gas flow. Can you reroute it, flood the lower decks with something unpleasant for our clone friends? Rico asked, his mind already calculating possible outcomes, most of which ended in varying levels of boom. Tinker's mismatched eyes flickered as he processed the request. Flooding the decks with gas? Risky. Could end up blowing us all to hell. Comforting, Vesper muttered, already regretting being part of this plan. Hey, I said risky, not impossible, Tinker replied, sounding almost offended. There's a hidden feature in the older mining modules, originally for emergencies. I can give it a tweak, make it work for us. Hidden feature? Lyra piped in, appearing as if she'd just emerged from a firefight, which, knowing her, she probably had. What, like a secret big red button that says, push for chaos? Not far off, Tinker said. It's more like, push for unnecessary explosions, but you get the gist. Great, Rico said. Let's give them a piece of our hospitality. Lyra, rally the crew. We've got one shot at this. If we time it right, we can clear the clones and make a run for the command deck. On it, Lyra said, already moving to gather their ragtag band of misfits, also known as the last hope for Ganymede-8. While Lyra set to work, Rico turned his attention to Vesper, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, preferably somewhere with a strong drink and less chance of imminent death. We're seriously doing this? Vesper asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and resignation. Got a better plan? Rico responded, raising an eyebrow. Vesper sighed, his shoulders slumping. No, but I was hoping you'd have one. What can I say? Improvisation's a gift, Rico said with a shrug. Besides, if this works, we might actually survive the day. If, Vesper echoed, always the optimist. Hey, optimism is just a lack of imagination, Rico said, flashing a grin that was more grimace than encouragement. As the crew gathered, Lyra outlined the plan with all the enthusiasm of someone who knew they were probably about to die but was determined to do it with panache. Listen up, she shouted over the din. We're going to flood the clones' playground with gas. The fun kind that doesn't make you pass out, but makes them shut down. Then we make a break for the command deck. A ripple of uncertain murmurs passed through the crowd, but the desperation in their eyes was clear. They needed hope, even if it came with a side of potential catastrophe. Any questions? Lyra asked, daring anyone to actually question the madness of the plan. Yeah, one brave soul piped up. What if it doesn't work? Then we're screwed, Lyra replied, succinctly. But it's better than sitting here waiting for them to pick us off. With that, the room fell silent, determination settling over them like a shoddy security blanket. It wasn't much, but it was something. Rico met Lyra's eyes and nodded. Let's do it. As Tinker started working his magic, the station groaned ominously, as if it could sense what was about to happen. The lights flickered, casting everything in a strobe-like effect that made the whole scene feel like a disjointed fever dream. All right, folks, hold on to your butts, Tinker announced, flipping a switch with what Rico could only assume was an exaggerated flourish. Here goes nothing. The effect was almost immediate. The lower decks filled with a hissing cloud of gas, visible even on the security monitors. The clones, previously moving with military precision, suddenly faltered, their synchronized movements dissolving into chaos. Some dropped like marionettes with their strings cut, others staggered, sparking as their systems shorted out. Look at that, Vesper observed, a hint of awe in his voice. It's actually working. Of course it is, Rico replied, though internally he was just as surprised. We're not dead yet. Tinker hovered nearby, a self-satisfied whir in his servos. Never doubt a bot with a few tricks up his chassis. That's one fire put out, Lyra said, rejoining them with a smirk. Now, let's go put out the rest. As they moved toward the command deck, the station continued to shudder beneath their feet, as if protesting the abuse it was being forced to endure. Rico led the charge, his headache a constant reminder of the stakes and the razor-thin line they walked between brilliance and disaster. The Zarkonians, having realized their distraction was failing, were regrouping, their chrome armor glinting menacingly under the harsh lights. Rico could see Zaurax at the forefront, mandibles clicking in what he had to assume was frustration, unless it was excitement. Zarkonians seemed to blur those lines with zeal. Time for our diplomatic finesse, Vesper said, falling into step beside Rico. A little muscle, a little bluff. Rico grinned, eyes fixed on their destination. I'm more of a, shoot first, negotiate later, kind of guy. Doesn't exactly inspire confidence, Vesper replied, a wry smile on his lips. Hey, you wanted me here? Rico shot back. This is what you get. Arriving at the command deck, they found it a pressure cooker of mounting tensions. The humans, weary but resolute, faced off against Zarkonians whose patience was wearing thinner than a politician's promise. Rico stepped forward, doing his best to exude a confidence he didn't quite feel. All right, Zawrax, time to back off. Your little coup didn't work, and we're not in the mood for round 2. The Zarkonian leader turned, eyes narrowing. You think you can stop us, human? Your precious station is nothing but a decaying relic. Rico shrugged, the nonchalance in his gesture as deliberate as it was dismissive. Decaying relic or not, it's still under our control. And in case you missed the memo, we're not going anywhere. Zawrax's mandibles clicked, a sound that set Rico's nerves on edge. You have 2 options, human. Surrender or be destroyed. Third option, Rico countered, raising his weapon. You leave, we keep breathing, and nobody has to scrape Zarkonian bits off the walls. Silence fell, the tension thick enough to slice with a plasma cutter. The Zarkonians shifted, their shiny armor reflecting the station's flickering glow. Then Vesper stepped up, his voice steady. The diplomat in him finally found its footing. Listen, Zawrax, we're not your enemy, but you're making a mistake. This station, these people, they're not your stepping stones. We can end this here, peacefully. Rico braced himself, waiting for the inevitable refusal, the impossible demands that were to follow. Instead, Zawrax did something unexpected. The Zarkonian leader paused, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the defiant faces around him. For a moment, just a fleeting second, he seemed to reconsider. This isn't over, Zawrax finally said, his voice a low growl of reluctant retreat. We will not forget this. Rico nodded, hiding his surprise behind a mask of cool detachment. Neither will we. Now, if you'll be so kind as to exit stage left. With a sharp gesture, Zawrax signaled his troops. The Zarkonians began to withdraw, their movements precise, deliberate. As they filed out, Rico allowed himself a small sigh of relief. Well, I'll be damned. We did it. For now, Vesper said, ever the realist. But don't get too comfortable. They'll be back, and they'll be smarter. Let them try, Lyra said, a grim smile on her lips. We'll be ready. As the tension slowly dissipated, leaving behind the familiar hum of the station, Rico couldn't help but chuckle. And here I thought today was going to be boring. Boring, Lyra replied, nudging him with her elbow. You really are a glutton for punishment, aren't you? Hey, keeps life interesting, Rico said, rubbing the back of his neck, finally feeling the tension ebb away. Interesting is one word for it, Vesper said. Suicidal is another. Rico grinned, the headache that had plagued him now a distant memory. You say that like they're mutually exclusive. As the crew began to disperse, exchanging weary smiles and silent acknowledgments of a job well done, Rico knew one thing for certain. In the grim dark expanse of space, where betrayal was a given and survival a daily challenge, having a plan, no matter how crazy, was often the only difference between living to see another day and becoming cosmic debris. And as far as Rico was concerned, it was a plan well executed. Rico Vandross liked to think he was a man of simple tastes. A strong drink, a weaker enemy, and a plan that barely made sense. Right now, the only thing he had was the third, which was a shame because he could really use the other 2. The corridor to the command deck stretched ahead, a metal gauntlet of flickering lights and ominous creaks. If the station were a living thing, Rico figured it would be trying to shake him off like fleas. Not that he blamed it. The team scurried down the hall, Lyra taking point with her usual reckless abandon, Vesper somewhere in the middle trying to look less like a diplomat and more like he belonged in this mess. Tinker was a clunking mass of purpose and servos, tinkering with anything that sparked his interest. Rico brought up the rear, mostly because if things went to hell, he preferred to be the last one to catch the bullet. Hey, Lyra, Rico called, his voice echoing off the metal walls. Yeah, boss, she replied without breaking stride. You think maybe next time we could just, not piss off an entire clone army? Lyra shot him a grin over her shoulder. What, and miss all this fun? Fun, sure. Rico supposed you could call it that if you had a death wish or maybe a complete lack of imagination. And those poor suckers in the Zarkonian armor, they were about to get a front row seat to the Vandross show, starring bad decisions and questionable odds. Tinker shuffled ahead, stopping briefly to interface with a panel. All right, folks, he said with a servo-assisted flourish. Last chance to back out and start new lives as farmers on Mars. Rico snorted. You ever see a Martian crop, Tinker? I'd rather take my chances here. The console responded with a series of beeps and a whoosh as the main doors slid open. Beyond lay the command deck, a battlefield waiting to happen. The Zarkonian welcome party was already there, their chrome armor reflecting the harsh lights, looking for all the world like overzealous Christmas ornaments. At the forefront stood Zawrax, mandibles twitching in a way that might have been a smile, or an aggressive dental problem. Vesper stepped up, straightening his jacket, trying to look less like a man in over his head and more like an ambassador with a plan. Zaurax, let's settle this with words, not weapons, he declared, all diplomatic poise. For a moment, Rico thought maybe they'd get out of this without a fight. Zaurax's response was a guttural series of clicks and hisses that Rico's translator generously interpreted as, surrender now, or face annihilation. Sounds like a no-go on the peace talks, Lyra muttered, her hand inching toward her sidearm. I'm shocked, Rico deadpanned. Truly, deeply shocked. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a plasma blade, and the Zarkonian troops shifted, ready to make their move. On 3, Rico whispered, his voice barely a breath. 1, 2. But before he could say 3, Tinker hit the button. A hissing sound filled the air, followed by the rapid deployment of gas from hidden vents. It spread quickly, a visible fog that turned the command deck into a scene straight out of a bad sci-fi horror flick. The Zarkonians froze, their organic components scrambling to process the unexpected chemical cocktail. Well, that's one way to start a party, Rico said, raising his voice over the chaos. How you doing, Vesper? Still got those diplomatic skills handy? Vesper nodded, stepping forward with a confidence Rico didn't feel. All right, Zaurax, here's the deal. You pull back your forces, and we don't turn you into scrap metal. Seems fair, right? The Zarkonian leader hesitated, his soldiers twitching, systems going haywire. It was a good look for them, Rico thought. A little humility never hurt. Zaurax's mandibles clicked furiously, a furious concerto of frustration. You think this changes anything? He spat. It changes the scenery, at least, Lyra quipped, coming up beside Rico. And we've got plenty more of that gas where this came from. The Zarkonians were off balance, literally and figuratively. Their formation broke, soldiers backing away, uncertain. All right, Vesper chimed in, the diplomat in him seeing an opening. Why waste good troops? You've already seen what we can do. Rico could see the hesitation in Zaurax's eyes, or whatever you called that reflective surface. It was the sort of calculation Rico banked on, the kind that only came with the sobering realization that you were in over your head. You get a choice, Rico said, taking a step forward. Retreat now, lick your wounds, and live to fight another day. Or stand here and find out what other tricks we've got up our sleeves. Zaurax's gaze swept the room, taking in his faltering troops, the humans ready to capitalize on the chaos. We will retreat. For now, he conceded, voice a grating growl of reluctant defeat. But know this, human, our vengeance will be swift. Yeah, Lyra said, waving him off with a dismissive flick of her hand. Join the club. The Zarkonians began their withdrawal, a stilted, disjointed movement, their usual precision lost to the chaos of Rico's plan. For now, it seemed, the station was theirs again. As the last of the Zarkonians filed out, Vesper let out a breath he probably hadn't realized he'd been holding. I can't believe that actually worked. Rico grinned, leaning against the console. What can I say? We humans are full of surprises. Mostly unpleasant ones, Tinker added, his servos whirring with amusement. Rico nodded, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading, leaving a tired but satisfied feeling behind. Yeah, but give it a few hours. Something's bound to go wrong. We'll deal with it, Lyra said, crossing her arms as she surveyed the command deck. After all, we're still here, aren't we? True enough, Rico replied. And I don't know about you, but I'm in the mood for a drink. As the group started to relax, the station's systems slowly coming back online, Rico couldn't help but chuckle. Once again, human ingenuity had won the day, or at least bought him some time. And in the grim dark depths of space, sometimes that was the best you could hope for. To surviving another day, Vesper offered, raising an imaginary glass. To making it interesting, Lyra replied, a wry smile on her lips. And to not getting blown up, Tinker added, ever the pragmatist. Rico nodded, satisfaction settling over him like a well-worn coat. Guess we'll see what tomorrow brings, he said, pushing off the console. With a final, shared glance, the crew began to disperse, the weight of their victory settling alongside the certainty of more trials ahead. But for now, in those fleeting moments, they'd take the win. Because in space, where every day was a gamble, winning was rare enough to savor. And Rico intended to savor every damn second of it. As they left the command deck behind, Rico turned to Tinker, a question simmering in his mind. Hey, Tinker, what was in that gas, anyway? Tinker paused, his servos whirring in contemplation. Trade secret, he said with a wink, or what passed for one in his robotic repertoire. Figures, Rico replied, shaking his head. Never trust a bot with secrets. Tinker's laughter was a mechanical chuckle, the sound echoing down the corridor as they made their way back to whatever qualified as normalcy on this tin can floating in the cosmos. And in the end, that was the real magic of it all. The ability to laugh in the face of the absurd, to find a semblance of camaraderie in the chaos. That's what kept them going, what made the impossible seem just a little less daunting. And if Rico was anything, he was a man who thrived in the impossible. As they stepped into the station's dimly lit corridors, the echoes of their footsteps mingling with the hum of machinery, Rico couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Not just in their victory, but in the people who made it happen. Misfits, rebels, and rogues, the kind of team that shouldn't work but somehow did. And for now, that was enough. The station was theirs again, at least for the moment. Not that it had much choice in the matter. It wasn't like the old tin can had legs to bolt with or a brain to forget this whole mess had happened. Rico leaned against the console, feeling the weight of a non-existent trophy of survival balanced precariously on his shoulders. He'd have preferred a drink, but he'd take what he could get. "Think the Zarkonians will send us a thank you card?" Lyra asked, sarcasm dripping from every syllable like oil from a rusty pipe. "I'd settle for them not sending a nuke," Rico replied, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "Or another clone army." He glanced around at his motley crew, Lyra, Tinker, and Vesper, the diplomat who had somehow managed to keep them from becoming Zarkonian pate. Eric, Vesper's ever-faithful assistant, stood by the door, clutching a bottle of whiskey like it was the last ounce of sanity in the universe. Vesper, trying to look less like a man who'd just navigated the tightrope of galactic politics and more like someone who knew what they were doing, approached Rico. "About our defense strategies, yeah, about those," Rico interrupted, shooting him a look that could cut glass. "We should probably get some." Vesper didn't have the time to look offended before Rico continued, "Look, I'm not saying your peace talks were a complete waste of time, but maybe next time, try not to negotiate with the guys pointing lasers at us." Vesper's smile was thin, like paper stretched over a pit of frayed nerves. "I'll add it to my list of diplomatic strategies. Don't negotiate with heavily armed maniacs." "Hey, it got us through today," Rico shrugged. "And who knows, maybe you'll get better at it." "That's the spirit," Eric chimed in, offering the whiskey to Rico, who took it without a second thought. "To future endeavors," Rico toasted, tipping the bottle toward Vesper. "May they be less likely to kill us." Vesper chuckled, a rare sound that momentarily lifted the grim shadow hanging over them. It was the sound of someone who had just sidestepped disaster, only to find themselves staring down the barrel of another. "So, what's next?" Tinker asked, his mechanical fingers tapping a rhythm against his leg as if he were always fixing something, even when it was just his own anxiety. "Now," Rico said, "we figure out how to keep this station from falling apart." "Again, sounds like a party," Lyra muttered, but Rico caught the glint of determination in her eyes. It was the look of someone who'd faced death and decided it owed her a favor. The group dispersed, each person falling into their usual roles, the comfort of routine a balm against the chaos of recent events. Tinker returned to his tinkering, Lyra checked the station's systems, and Vesper went about re-establishing communication with whatever poor saps back on Earth were trying to keep track of this farce. As Rico walked the corridors, he couldn't help but think of the station as a tired old beast that had been prodded one too many times. It groaned and creaked, the sound of metal under stress, a familiar symphony of discontent. But it was their home, their stronghold against an uncaring universe. "Hey, boss," Lyra called from where she leaned over a console, her eyes glued to the readouts. "We've got power fluctuations in Sector 5. Again." Rico rolled his eyes. "Of course we do. Be a miracle if something actually worked right." "Miracles are for preachers and fools," Lyra said, smirking. "We've got duct tape and sarcasm. And what a deadly combo they make," Rico replied, moving to join her. Together, they set to work, patching the station up one problem at a time. It was tedious work, but there was a satisfaction in it, a sense of accomplishment that came from holding the chaos at bay. Even if it was just for a little while. "What do you think the odds are the Zarkonians come back?" Lyra asked, her voice low, as if speaking too loud might jinx their fragile peace. "Pretty damn high," Rico admitted. "But we'll be ready." Lyra straightened, her expression serious. "We always are. That's the spirit," Rico said, clapping her on the shoulder. "Now let's see if we can get through a whole day without any more surprises." As if on cue, the lights flickered, the station's way of reminding him not to get too comfortable. Rico sighed. Some things never changed. Eventually, the crew regrouped in the station's mess hall, a space that could charitably be described as stark, with metal tables and chairs that seemed to have been designed by someone with a grudge against comfort. But it was the heart of their little operation, the place where they came to regroup and refuel. Eric was already there, setting up a makeshift bar with the skill of a man who'd spent far too many hours catering to Vesper's diplomatic needs. Drinks, anyone? Rico raised his hand like a schoolboy too eager for recess. Hit me. As Eric poured out shots, Rico took a moment to appreciate the absurdity of it all. Here they were, floating in the void, a ragtag group of misfits holding the line against the unknown. It was enough to make even the most cynical among them feel a pang of something suspiciously like hope. To surviving another day, Vesper said, raising his glass. To making it interesting, Lyra added, echoing their earlier toast. And to not getting blown up, Tinker concluded, ever the realist. They drank, the burn of the alcohol a welcome distraction from the reality that awaited them outside the station's thin walls. So, Vesper said, setting his glass down with a clink, defense strategies. Right, Rico replied, leaning back in his chair. I was thinking bigger guns, more traps, and maybe a fleet of killer drones. And here I thought you didn't have a plan, Vesper said, the corners of his mouth twitching. Who needs a plan when you've got killer drones? Rico quipped. Lyra snorted, her laughter a bright spark in the gloom. I like the way you think. The conversation shifted, moving from defense strategies to more mundane topics. They talked about the station's repairs, shared stories of past misadventures, and speculated about what the Zarkonians were doing. It was a brief moment of normality, a reminder of what they were fighting for. As the hours passed, the crew drifted in and out of the mess hall, each person taking their turn at the bar to grab a drink or a quick bite to eat. The atmosphere was relaxed, a rare reprieve from the usual tension that hung over them like a storm cloud. Eventually, it was just Rico and Vesper, sitting across from each other, the room quiet except for the hum of the station's systems. It was a silence that invited conversation, the kind that came when two people found themselves on the same side of a conflict. You know, Vesper said, breaking the silence, I didn't expect to be here. None of us did, Rico replied, studying the man across from him. But you've done all right, considering. High praise, Vesper said, a hint of amusement in his voice. But I'm not sure I'm cut out for this kind of work. Rico shrugged. None of us are, but you get used to it. You ever think about what you'd be doing if you weren't here? Rico chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Probably dead in a ditch somewhere. Or farming on Mars. Vesper raised an eyebrow. Farming? Yeah, Rico said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Because nothing says, fulfilling career, like Martian soil. They shared a laugh, the sound echoing off the metal walls, a brief respite from the weight of their responsibilities. Seriously, though, Rico said, sobering. You've done good work. We wouldn't have made it without you. Vesper nodded, accepting the compliment with a grace that belied his earlier uncertainty. Let's hope I can keep it up. That's the spirit, Rico said, raising his glass for a final toast. To future endeavors. To future endeavors, Vesper echoed, clinking his glass against Rico's. They drank, the silence between them a comfortable one, the kind that came from shared experiences and mutual respect. As they sat there, each lost in their own thoughts, the station continued its silent vigil, a tired old beast with a heart of steel and circuits, watching over its ragtag crew. In the end, they were all just passengers on this rusted ship, floating through the void, trying to make sense of a universe that seemed determined to make their lives as difficult as possible. But they were survivors, each in their own way, and that was enough to keep them going. Because in the grim dark depths of space, where every day was a gamble and nothing was guaranteed, sometimes the best you could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. And as Rico sat there, the whiskey warming his insides, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude, not just for surviving another day, but for the people who'd made it possible. They were a strange, mismatched crew, bound together by circumstance and necessity. But they were his crew, and for better or worse, they were in this together. With a final nod to Vesper, Rico stood, the weight of his responsibilities settling back on his shoulders like an old, familiar coat. It was time to get back to work, to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because the universe wasn't going to wait for them to catch their breath, it never did. But as long as they had each other, and a little luck, they might just make it through. And maybe, just maybe, they'd even get a chance to save the world, one bad decision at a time.